Mid-July 1941. The heat is unbearable, and the thick dust, raised by thousands of tracks and wheels, hangs over the roads of Belarus and Western Russia like a dense, suffocating shroud. A German officer, commander of a tank unit, wipes his protective glasses and looks through binoculars to the east. In his mind, nurtured by triumphant marches across Europe, the world picture is perfectly clear. Behind him are shattered Soviet divisions, burning airfields, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Ahead, as he believes, lies an open road to Moscow, only a few hundred kilometers away. According to command plans, the campaign should be completed before the autumn muddy season. He is confident that the Red Army is no longer capable of organized resistance, that before him are only scattered groups of retreating, demoralized people. But when the dust settles a little, he sees not an empty horizon, but flashes of artillery salvos. The ground trembles not from the movement of his tanks, but from a counterstrike. At this moment, on the approaches to an ancient city on the Dnieper, the familiar logic of the blitzkrieg begins to show its first, barely noticeable, but fatal malfunction. Instead of panicked flight, he encounters a wall of fire and steel which, contrary to all laws of military science of that time, does not collapse, but only becomes denser. It is here, in the dusty fields near Smolensk, that the drama begins that will turn the tide of all world history, although on that hot July day, none of the participants yet realized the true scale of what was happening. To understand the nature of this colossal clash, one must look at the map through the eyes of strategists of that time. Smolensk is not just a point on the globe. It is the historical gateway to the heart of Russia. Between the headwaters of the Dnieper and the western Dvina lies the so-called Smolensk Gateway, a strip of dry, firm ground ideal for the movement of large masses of troops. Any conqueror moving from the west to Moscow, be it Napoleon or the German General Staff, inevitably runs into this geographical bottleneck. By midsummer of '41, Army Group Center under the command of Field Marshal von Bock had gained monstrous inertial momentum. Their tank wedges, led by masters of maneuver warfare like Guderian and Hoth, had already cut through the Soviet defenses and were rushing to close the ring around yet another Soviet army. It seemed that the Minsk scenario would repeat: a rapid breakthrough, encirclement, liquidation of the pocket, and further movement to the capital. However, the Soviet command, despite the chaos of the first weeks, perfectly understood the significance of this line. Reserves were hastily transferred to the Smolensk area. Echelons with new divisions flowed continuously, often unloading directly into the field and immediately entering battle. The Stavka, it seemed, was doing the impossible, trying to stitch together a new defensive front from a patchwork quilt of disparate units. The external picture of the battle, which unfolded on a giant arc of 600 kilometers, was chaos on an unprecedented scale. This was not a classic trench warfare with clear lines of trenches. It was a layered cake of mobile cauldrons, breakthroughs, and counterattacks. German tank groups, accustomed to acting like a surgical scalpel, suddenly found that the tissue of resistance had become viscous and unpredictable. The Barbarossa plan was falling apart not because the Germans had forgotten how to fight, but because Soviet troops refused to admit defeat, even in hopeless situations. On July 10th, what historians would later call the Battle of Smolensk began. German wedges rushed to Vitebsk and Mogilev, forcing the Dnieper. But instead of the expected operational space, they encountered furious counterattacks. Soviet mechanized corps, often without proper reconnaissance and air support, threw themselves at German panzers. These were desperate blows, but it was they that forced German columns to stop, turn around, and spend precious fuel and ammunition repelling attacks from the flanks. For the first time in World War II, German generals in their diaries began to note not only the number of captured trophies, but also the growing alarm about the stability of their troops. The defense of Mogilev was particularly indicative, where the city's defenders held out for more than 2 weeks in complete encirclement. This was the first signal that the blitzkrieg strategy, designed to psychologically break the enemy, was not working here. German infantry, following the tanks, was forced to bite into every village, every forest. The pace of the offensive, which was the basis of German doctrine, began to fall. If in Poland and France the pace was tens of kilometers per day, here it dropped to a few kilometers, and sometimes hundreds of meters. It was in these days, on July 14th near Orsha, that the volley of a new, previously unknown weapon was heard for the first time. Captain Flerov's battery struck with rocket launchers, which would later receive the affectionate name Katyusha. The fiery whirlwind that enveloped the railway junction caused not just destruction, but genuine panic in the enemy's rank. This was a psychological shock. An army that was considered almost defeated suddenly had a weapon of terrible destructive power. This episode became a symbol that the technological superiority of the Wehrmacht was not absolute. However, behind the dry lines of operational reports lay a deep human drama, forming the second internal layer of this conflict. For the Soviet soldier and commander, the summer of 41st was a time of the gravest moral choice. Imagine the state of people who see their familiar world collapsing. Communication with command is constantly interrupted. Neighbors to the right and left retreat or disappear in encirclement, and the sky is completely dominated by planes with black crosses. In such conditions, it is easy to succumb to panic, throw down weapons, and try to escape. And such cases did occur, and there were many of them. But the paradox of Smolensk was that not panic, but fierce stubbornness became a mass phenomenon. People who found themselves in encirclements continued to fight even when ammunition and food ran out. General Lukin, commander of the Smolensk encircled group, became the embodiment of this tragic resilience. Realizing that no help was coming, he continued to tie down significant enemy forces, preventing them from moving on Moscow. In his actions and the actions of his soldiers, a new motivation emerged. If you cannot win, you must sell your life as dearly as possible. Every hour gained in encircled Smolensk turned into concrete fortifications on the approaches to the capital, into the formation of new divisions in the rear. On the other side of the front, a psychological transformation was also taking place. The letters of German soldiers home, sent in July and August, differ sharply from the bravura reports of June. They reveal a fear of the Russian infinity and a misunderstanding of the enemy. They wrote that the Russians did not surrender according to the rules of military science, that even a burning tank continued to fire, and infantry rose to attack where all living things should have been destroyed. The legendary Guderian, author of the tank breakthrough strategy, later admitted in his memoirs that it was near Smolensk that he first felt doubt about the success of the entire campaign. The Germans encountered a phenomenon that did not fit into their rational worldview. An enemy, having lost control and supply, did not disintegrate into atoms, but turned into many autonomous pockets of resistance, each of which had to be suppressed by force. This was exhausting not only physically but also morally. Elite Wehrmacht units, having passed through all of Europe, began to lose their luster and confidence. The dust of Russian roads permeated not only their engines, but also the souls of the conquerors. sowing there the seeds of future catastrophe. At a third, deeper level, the Battle of Smolensk became a clash of two ideologies, two systems of values, and ultimately, two concepts of time. For the German command, time was a resource to be compressed. Speed was their god. The entire philosophy of Nazi Germany was built on the idea of rapid, lightning-fast results, on proving racial and organizational superiority through efficiency. A prolonged war was tantamount to defeat for them, as the Reich's economy was not designed for a long confrontation with the resources of a vast country. For the Soviet side, time acquired a different, sacred meaning. Time became synonymous with the survival of the nation. The Soviet leadership, despite the harshness and sometimes cruelty of its decisions, adopted a terrible but the only possible strategy in those circumstances: exchanging space and people for time. This was a monstrous exchange rate where thousands of lives were paid for a single day's delay of the enemy. In this philosophical conflict, the German machine, working like clockwork, clashed with Russian chaos, which, strangely enough, proved to be more viable. The Soviet system, despite all its shortcomings, repressions, and mistakes of the pre-war years, demonstrated an astonishing capacity for regeneration. While regular divisions were perishing near Smolensk, deep within the country, the mobilization mechanism was working at full throttle. Millions of people stood at machines, new armies were formed and sent to the front. The idea of defending the motherland, purified of political husk, became the core that united people. It was near Smolensk that the war finally ceased to be a clash of armies and became the Great Patriotic War. Here, in blood and fire, the understanding was born that there would be no compromise, that it was about the physical existence of the people. The German idea of Lebensraum collided with the Soviet idea of not one step back, which, although it would only be officially formalized into an order a year later, was already effectively operating in the minds of the defenders of Smolensk. It was a clash of cold calculation with self-sacrifice, and as history showed, self-sacrifice proved stronger than calculation in the long run. The turning point that transformed the entire war came in late July, early August. German generals, looking at their maps, saw that the road to Moscow was open, but their flanks were stretched and constantly under attack. Logistics began to falter. Trains with fuel and ammunition couldn't keep up with the advanced units due to poor road conditions and partisan activity. A fierce dispute arose at Hitler's headquarters. The Army High Command insisted on immediately continuing the offensive on Moscow, believing that the capture of the capital, as a political and transportation center, would lead to the collapse of the Soviet system. However, Hitler, seeing the tenacity of Soviet troops near Smolensk and fearing flank attacks, especially from the still strong group in Ukraine, made a decision that many historians consider a fatal mistake for Germany. Directive number 33 ordered the suspension of the advance on Moscow and the turning of tank groups north towards Leningrad and south towards Kyiv. This decision was a direct consequence of the Battle of Smolensk. The fierce resistance of the Red Army forced the German leadership to doubt the security of their flanks. Smolensk became the stone against which German strategy stumbled. Hitler decided to first destroy Soviet forces on the flanks, secure himself, and only then proceed to Moscow. This turn bought the Soviet Union even more precious time. The focus of the German war machine became diffused. Instead of one crushing blow with a fist, they began to spread their fingers, trying to grasp everything at once. At this time, another crucial event was taking place near Smolensk. Soviet troops were not just defending, they were learning to attack. In late August, early September, the Yelnia offensive operation began. The culmination of the 2-month slaughter was precisely the battle for the Yelnia salient. German troops had wedged themselves into the Soviet defenses, forming a dangerous salient that threatened further breakthroughs. General Zhukov, appointed to command the reserve front, organized a series of counterattacks. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Soviet artillery and aviation were able to create the necessary superiority on a narrow sector of the front. The battles were brutal. The ground was so churned by shells that the landscape changed. But the result was stunning. On September 6th, Soviet troops liberated Yelnia. This was the first time the Wehrmacht was forced to abandon significant captured territory, not for tactical reasons of front alignment, but under direct pressure from a strong enemy. The myth of the invincibility of the German army was cracked. It was near Yelnia that the Soviet Guard was born. 4 rifle divisions, which showed the greatest heroism and skill, were the first to receive the title of Guards. This was a colossal morale boost for the entire country. People saw that the Germans could not only be delayed, but also beaten, forced to flee. The price of this success and of 2 months of containment was monstrous. The losses of the Red Army in the Battle of Smolensk numbered in the hundreds of thousands. A huge number of soldiers and officers were captured or put out of action due to wounds. Technical losses were also colossal. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were left to burn in the fields. Critics of the Soviet command often point to these figures as proof of the incompetence of the leadership, which buried the enemy with bodies. Indeed, the level of troop control often left much to be desired. Orders were delayed, intelligence was wrong, coordination between branches of service was lame. Senseless frontal attacks on fortified enemy positions led to unjustified casualties. But if one considers the situation in the context of alternatives, the picture changes. If the Red Army had not imposed these exhausting battles on the Wehrmacht, if it had retreated, preserving its men, German tanks would have entered Moscow in August or September of '41. Then the Soviet Union would not have had time to evacuate industry to the east, would not have had time to bring up Siberian divisions, would not have had time to prepare the defense of the capital. The resonance of the events of the summer of '41 is heard even today. The lessons of Smolensk go far beyond military tactics. This is a story of how a system on the verge of collapse finds internal resources for resistance. This is a lesson that ideal plans on paper always break against the human factor and the unpredictability of reality. The Battle of Smolensk showed that in a war of attrition, the one who possesses greater will and readiness for sacrifice for a higher goal wins. For the modern world, this is a reminder of the fragility of civilization and that security and sovereignty sometimes have to be paid for at the highest price. In the fields near Smolensk lie thousands of nameless soldiers, whose remains search parties still find today. Their sacrifice was not in vain. They did not see the victorious May of '45, but it was they who laid the first stone in the foundation of that victory. They turned the blitzkrieg into a protracted war, for which Germany was not ready. In September of '41, as the fighting near Smolensk began to subside and the front temporarily stabilized, the weather started to change. Dust storms gave way to autumn rains, turning roads into impassable mud, beyond which the first frosts loomed. The German officer, the very one who in July had gazed eastward through binoculars with the confidence of a victor, now perhaps looked with apprehension at the gray, low sky. He understood that Moscow was still ahead, but it had become infinitely distant. Instead of a parade on Red Square, winter in the trenches awaited him, cold and uncertainty. Smolensk had fulfilled its task. It had become the barrier against which the wave of invasion broke, losing its destructive energy. And although there were still 4 long years of war ahead, the Battle of Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, all of this became possible only because in July, August, and September of '41, Soviet soldiers stood to the death at the ancient walls of Smolensk, buying with their blood a future for their country and the entire world. The cycle closed. The summer heat and the aggressor's optimism were replaced by autumn cold and a premonition of inevitable retribution. History made its choice, and this choice was made not in politicians' offices, but in the trenches of Smolensk land. The Battle of Smolensk left us a complex legacy. It is not a glossy picture of victory, but a harsh canvas woven from mistakes and heroism, despair and hope. Historians' debates about the ratio of losses and results will never cease. But one fact remains undeniable. It was here that the plan for a lightning war collapsed. The operational pause that Hitler was forced to take after Smolensk became the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. This reminds us that even the most perfect war machine can be stopped by the power of the human spirit and a readiness for self-sacrifice. And when we look at the map today, we should see not just city names, but frontiers where the fate of humanity was decided. Smolensk is an eternal monument to the courage of those who stepped into eternity to stop an evil that seemed invincible. Their silent feet rings louder than any fanfares, reminding us of the price of peace and freedom.